It was a cold winter morning in New York City. The wind howled through the narrow streets, and the sidewalks were damp from a persistent drizzle that made everyone pull their coats tighter around their bodies. People hurried by, their faces absorbed in their routines, as the world seemed to rush ahead without paying attention to the details. Henry, an 86-year-old man, walked slowly, leaning on an old dark wooden cane. His clothes were worn, patched in some places, but clean. He maintained a dignity that had endured through the years, although his steps were shaky and his eyes clouded from the hardships of a long, solitary life. That morning, he had decided to get a hot cup of coffee to warm his aging body. It had been days since he had a decent cup, and the mere thought of the strong aroma filling his nostrils gave him the strength to face the biting wind. As he spotted a small diner at the corner of the street, with its warm lights reflecting on the glass, Henry entered with a sigh of relief. The doorbell tinkled faintly as he crossed the threshold, drawing a few discreet glances from the few customers scattered around. The young server, with short blonde hair, barely looked up as he approached the counter. "Good morning," Henry said, his voice low and raspy. "Could I please get a coffee?" The young woman gave him a brief look, but it was heavy with disdain. He seemed out of place in this setting of younger, hurried patrons. She crossed her arms and asked, without bothering to hide her impatience, "Do you have money to pay?" Henry hesitated for a moment, his trembling fingers reaching into the pocket of his old pants. He pulled out a few coins, counting them slowly, as if each one were a relic. There was enough, but the exact sum exposed him to the cruelty of the server, who raised an eyebrow and let out a sarcastic laugh. "You're really counting coins for a coffee?" she scoffed. "This isn't a charity house. If you can't pay properly, why don't you go somewhere else?" Henry felt his face flush. The woman's words echoed in his mind, each one like a blow, and he lowered his head, feeling the weight of shame. He was about to turn and leave when he heard a firm voice behind him. "I'll pay for his coffee." Clara, a woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed with brown hair tied in a bun, stood there, observing the scene. There was something in Henry's posture that touched her deeply. The old man's humiliation resonated within her in a way she couldn't explain. She wasn't the type to interfere in such situations, but at that moment, she felt compelled to do something. "Bring your best coffee," Clara added, looking directly into the server's eyes, who now seemed unsettled. "And add a croissant." The young woman, left with no choice, obeyed silently. Henry, still confused, tried to thank her, but the words wouldn't come out. Clara just smiled and pointed to an empty table in the corner of the diner. "Please sit with me. I think we could talk." Henry, hesitant, followed her to the table. Clara asked him to sit while the coffee and croissant were brought. The silence between them felt comfortable, almost familiar, even though they had never met before. When the drink arrived, Henry held the cup with both hands, feeling the comforting warmth spread through his tired body. "You didn't have to do this, ma'am," he finally said, his voice weak but sincere. "I'm just an old man. We get used to what life gives us." Clara, however, looked at him with a gentle expression, as if she saw something beyond his words. There was more to this man than met the eye. "No one deserves to be treated like that," she replied. "And please, call me Clara." Her name was followed by a brief silence, as if they were both absorbing what had just happened. Clara studied Henry more closely, and something began to form in her mind. Something familiar. She tried to shake off the feeling of déjà vu, but couldn't help sensing that there was something in the man's features that reminded her of her own past. "Your name is Henry, right?" she asked, catching his name as he took a sip of his coffee. "Yes, Henry," he confirmed, not paying much attention. "Life has left me old and alone. My wife passed away many years ago, and my brother, well, he died too 10 years ago. Since then, I've been wandering, trying to find some meaning." At the mention of a brother, Clara felt a pang in her chest. Her father had also disappeared from her life many years ago, with no clear explanations. She grew up not knowing what had happened, and that absence had always been an open wound. "Your brother? What was his name?" Clara asked cautiously, feeling she was about to uncover something important. Frank, Henry replied, and his face lit up briefly at the memory. He was a good man, but life was hard on him too. He died young, and I never knew what happened to his family. He had a daughter, but I never found out what became of her. Clara felt her heart race. Frank, her father, the man who had disappeared from her life without a trace. And now, in front of her, was Henry, her uncle, the only living connection left to that lost past. Frank, she murmured, almost voiceless. Frank was my father. The coffee had grown cold on the table, but Clara and Henry seemed oblivious to the passage of time. The revelation hung between them like a cloud, heavy with confusing emotions. Clara didn't know what to say, and Henry, in turn, seemed stunned. He had spent so many years disconnected from any family, believing all ties were lost, and now, faced with this woman claiming to be his niece, words escaped him. Clara was trying to process everything, her thoughts spinning. Her father, Frank, a man whose absence had shaped her life in so many ways, was closer than she had ever imagined, now represented by Henry, his older brother. An uncle. How was it possible that she had never heard of him? I don't know where to begin, Clara said, her voice faltering for a moment. My father disappeared when I was very young. My mother and I always wondered what happened to him. We never got clear answers. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. He died 10 years ago, you said? Henry nodded, his tired eyes reflecting the pain of old memories. Yes, it was a shock to me too. He had been living in another city far away. I never knew exactly what drove him to distance himself from everyone. His death was sudden, and I never managed to get in touch with his family. Henry seemed lost in his own thoughts, as if he were trying to piece together a long-forgotten puzzle. But now that I think of it, he mentioned you once. When you were still young. He said he missed his daughter very much. Clara, right? She swallowed hard, fighting to keep her emotions in check. Henry's words resonated deeply within her. Her father had missed her. Somehow, even though it was late, that knowledge was a relief. My mother, Clara began, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. She rarely spoke about what happened. She grew very bitter after he left us. I never truly understood why, and over time I stopped asking. But knowing that he still thought of me, that changes something. Her eyes became distant, as if she were reviewing all those years, all the unanswered questions she had carried for so long. Henry watched his niece with a mixture of guilt and affection. He had lost contact with Frank long before his death, and now he regretted not doing more to find him. The consequences of that distance echoed in Clara's words, as if fate was showing them both the cost of unhealed wounds. I had no idea, Henry murmured, more to himself than to Clara. I should have done something. I should have looked for you. But life, he sighed deeply. Life swallows us up, and before we know it, we're drifting. Clara remained silent for a few seconds, reflecting on those words. It was true. Life had swallowed her too, with her career, her commitments, the constant attempts to fill a void that, deep down, she knew had to do with her father. And now, suddenly, she was faced with an opportunity to learn more about the past. An opportunity to reconnect the ties she had believed were lost forever. Henry, I need to know more, she said, with a determined gleam in her eyes. I need to understand what happened to my father. And more importantly, I want to know more about you, about our family. Henry looked at her, surprised by the intensity of her words. He never expected that, at his advanced age, he would have another chance to connect with someone from his family. He felt a tightness in his chest, but it was a sweet feeling, one of hope. Perhaps he still had time to make up for some of the past mistakes. There's so much I could tell you, he said with a faint smile. But there's something you need to know, Clara. I'm not the only one. The words came out with difficulty, as if they carried a burden he had been shouldering alone for a long time. After your father separated from your mother, there was a brief reconciliation between him and an old companion. It was a confusing time, and I got involved with her as well. I know it sounds strange, but there was something between us, something that led to a child. Your half-brother. Clara blinked, shocked. Henry's words echoed in her mind, but it took a few seconds for them to fully make sense. What? She asked, almost in disbelief. Half-brother? Are you saying I have a brother on top of everything else? Henry nodded, his expression sad but resolute. Yes. He was born a few years after you. I never married his mother, and we drifted apart. But the boy, Jack, he's a part of me, part of our family, and I've thought about him a lot in recent years. He lost contact with me a long time ago as well. I was an absent father, Clara. Just as I've been absent from so many things in my life. His voice was now thick with emotion. I don't know where he is. I've been trying to find him for years, but without success. Clara felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. A brother. Another part of her story she had been completely unaware of. How could her life have been built on so many secrets, so many missing pieces? The initial shock gave way to a sense of urgency. If there was a brother, she needed to find him. Not just out of curiosity, but for something deeper. It was an opportunity to rewrite her story, to build a bridge to the past that had been destroyed with her father's disappearance. We'll find him, Henry, Clara said firmly. We'll figure out where he is. And if he's willing, we'll be part of his life. We can't let these scars stay open. Not anymore. Henry felt a solitary tear roll down his cheek. It was as if life, after so many years of hardness and isolation, was offering him a small glimmer of redemption. You're very much like your father, he said, smiling tenderly. He always fought for what he believed in, too. Clara smiled, feeling warmth from those words. At last, she felt like she was on the verge of discovering the answers she had always sought, and that, without knowing it, Frank had left in her a strength that was now guiding her to face the mysteries of her own family. Henry took a deep breath and looked out the diner window. The day remained cold, but inside him, something new was beginning to ignite. A spark of hope. They would find Jack. The past may have been full of separations, but the present still offered them a chance to reconnect. Where do we start? Clara asked, already forming plans in her mind. First, I need to tell you everything I know about him, Henry responded, more animated than he had been in years. The last time I saw him was a long time ago, but some memories are still clear. Maybe we can follow those clues. And so, under the biting cold of New York City, Clara and Henry began to map out the path to find Jack, the brother she had never known, but who now became a vital piece in the reconstruction of her identity. The cold New York wind blew harder as Clara and Henry left the diner, but inside them, something was starting to warm up. The revelation of a lost half-brother, Jack, had created an unexpected connection between the present and the past, and Clara felt a growing urgency to uncover more. As they walked through the narrow, bustling streets of the city, Henry began to share the few memories he had of Jack. The last time I saw him, he was 16, Henry began, his voice low, as if reliving the moment in his mind. He was a quiet but determined young man. He had Frank's spirit, a strength that always seemed to be fighting against the world. I wasn't there for him the way I should have been. It was hard for him to understand my absences, and I think, deep down, he resented me for it. Clara listened attentively, absorbing every word as if it were a vital clue in the puzzle of her own life. She knew that the search for Jack wouldn't be easy, but something inside her was driving her forward. Maybe it was the sense of finally being in control of her own story, or perhaps it was the opportunity to build bonds she had never had the chance to create. Where was he the last time you knew? Clara asked, trying to piece together the information. He was living on the outskirts of New York, Henry responded, pausing to recall the details. He worked as a mechanic, I think. He had a natural talent with machines, but he was a rebellious kid, always trying to find his own way. His mother, Rose, and I separated before he grew up, and I think that affected him. When we drifted apart, Jack started to distance himself from me, too. He never understood why I had to leave, and I didn't know how to explain. Henry's words carried the weight of regret, but Clara knew this wasn't the time to dive into guilt. They needed action, answers. There was an entire life behind that silence, and she was determined to find Jack, wherever he might be. "We'll start there," Clara said, her determination surprising even Henry. "We'll visit garages, ask about him. If he's still around, someone must know Jack." Henry looked at Clara, amazed by her energy. She had the spirit of a detective, and that filled him with hope. Perhaps, after all, they could find the son he had lost. They walked the streets for hours, talking about the past, about Frank, and about the lives they had each led. The garages and workshops on the outskirts of the city became their destination, but at each door they knocked on, the answer was the same. No one seemed to know Jack. It was at a small garage in a suburban area, almost hidden between old buildings, that they finally found a lead. A short, stocky man, covered in oil-stained overalls, paused from sanding a car part to listen to Clara's questions. He furrowed his brow when he heard the name. "Jack!" "Yeah, the name sounds familiar," he said, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "He worked here for a while, sure. Been a few years since he left. He was good with machines, but didn't like staying in one place for too long." Clara's heart raced. Finally, a clue. "Do you know where he went?" she asked, trying to contain her anxiety. The man thought for a moment, looking down as if trying to recall. "I think he mentioned moving down south. Maybe Georgia? I remember him saying he wanted to start fresh there." He shrugged. After that, didn't hear from him again. Georgia. The word echoed in Clara's mind like a distant beacon. Was that where Jack was? Or was this just another lead that would take them to another dead end? She looked at Henry, who seemed torn between hope and the fear of being disappointed again. "Georgia," Henry repeated with a sigh. "It's far, but if he's there, we have to go." Clara nodded. There was no more time to lose. They would leave immediately, even though the road ahead was long and uncertain. There was something bigger at play now. They were rebuilding more than just family ties. They were unearthing secrets, healing old wounds, and trying, in some way, to make up for lost time. 2 days later, Clara and Henry arrived in Georgia, a state nestled among rolling hills, with its lush greenery and warm southern charm. Despite the fatigue from the journey, Clara felt a growing excitement. Georgia represented more than just a new place. Here, among the trees and old towns, might lie the answer she had been seeking for so long. They visited several garages in the area, asking about Jack in each one. The responses were always uncertain, but one finally brought a glimmer of hope. A young mechanic, while adjusting the engine of a car, looked curiously when Clara mentioned the name. "Yeah, I think I know a Jack," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He works at a garage further out, on the edge of town. Quiet guy. Doesn't talk much about his life, but everyone knows him for being a great mechanic." Clara and Henry exchanged glances. They were close. Following the young mechanic's directions, they reached the garage at the end of a dirt road. It was a modest place, almost hidden among the trees, but there was a peacefulness about it that contrasted with the chaos of their lives over the past few weeks. As they entered, Clara felt her heart quicken. She took in every detail, every sound of tools and muffled conversations, until she saw him. Jack was facing away from them, focused on an engine, his skilled hands working on the parts. His dark hair fell over his forehead, and he seemed completely absorbed in his work. Clara paused for a moment, trying to absorb the reality of the moment. It was him, the brother she had never known, but who, in a way, was already a part of her. Henry, beside her, seemed frozen, his hands trembling with nerves. "Jack," Clara called out, her voice shaky and uncertain. The man turned slowly, surprise etched on his face. His eyes settled on Clara, then on Henry, and a mixture of confusion and caution filled his expression. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse, yet filled with suspicion. Clara stepped forward, trying to find the right words. She knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation, but she had come this far. There was no turning back now. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice firm but laced with emotion. "I'm your sister." Jack remained motionless, his eyes studying every word, as if trying to grasp what this all meant. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with questions and emotions that had yet to be revealed. The silence that followed Clara's revelation was almost suffocating. Jack looked at her and Henry with a mixture of disbelief and distrust. The sound of the engine he had been working on still reverberated through the garage, but everything around them seemed to have frozen. Clara, nervous, felt her heart racing. There was no amount of preparation that could have readied her for this moment. "My sister," Jack murmured, narrowing his eyes as he wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt. "I don't know what you're talking about." Henry took a hesitant step forward. He felt the weight of all the years of absence, all the mistakes he had made, and now, more than ever, the possibility of mending a part of his past was before him. But he knew that reconciliation would not come easily. "Jack," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm Henry, your father." Shock crossed Jack's face like a flash of restrained anger. He looked at the elderly man before him, and his eyes, previously uncertain, filled with a sharp coldness. Clara could feel the tension in the air. This reunion wouldn't be a simple exchange of hugs and tears. The wounds were too deep, too much time had been lost. "My father," Jack repeated, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "The man who left me when I was still a kid? The man who never came back? Who left me behind like I didn't matter?" He stepped forward, his presence looming over Henry. "And now you show up, after all these years, and expect me to just accept I'm your father?" Clara felt the sting of Jack's words as if they were her own. His anger was justified. Henry, for his part, lowered his head, seeming smaller than ever. It was as if the very strength that had kept him going all these years was now unraveling. "You're right," Henry said, his voice low but steady. "I failed you. I was absent, I made bad decisions, and those decisions cost me everything. They cost me you. I know I can't turn back time, but I'm here now trying to fix that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know the truth." Jack crossed his arms, visibly uncomfortable with their presence. But something in Henry's eyes seemed to touch a part of him that he had been trying to hide. Clara, seeing the tension between the two, decided to step in. "Jack, I know this must be a shock for you," she said in a softer tone. "It was for me too. I didn't even know you existed until a few days ago. But we're family, and I think we've all lost too much time. Maybe it's time to try and understand what happened." Jack looked at her, and for a brief moment, the anger seemed to fade. He saw something in Clara's eyes, perhaps a sincerity he hadn't expected. But even so, the distrust remained strong. "Family?" He laughed bitterly. "I grew up without a father. My mom did the best she could, but it was never easy. The only thing I ever knew about my father was that he left. And now, after all this time, you show up and expect me to just accept it." Clara knew Jack's pain ran deep, and that it would take much more than words to heal that relationship. But she wasn't ready to give up. "We're not expecting you to accept anything, Jack," she responded, firmly. "We're not here to force anything. But the truth is, we're part of your story just like you're part of ours. We can't change the past, but we can choose what we do with the future." For a moment, Jack stood silent, and Clara could almost see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, but their presence was stirring something inside him, something he had been burying for years. Still, opening the door to the past he had long avoided wouldn't be easy. "I don't know," he finally muttered, looking from Henry to Clara. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." Henry, who had remained quiet since Jack's outburst of anger, took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly, but he took another step forward, his voice low, almost pleading. "Son, I understand. I don't deserve anything from you, not even this conversation we're having right now. But I want you to know that at least I'm here, not to ask for forgiveness, but to tell you that, despite everything, you've never left my thoughts. And if there's anything I can do now, anything, I want to try." Jack watched him for a long moment, and Clara could see his internal struggle, the desire to push away those confusing emotions, mixed with the human need to understand his roots, to heal old wounds. "And you?" he asked Clara, turning his gaze away from Henry. "What do you want from me? You say you're my sister, but we've never met. Why are you here?" Clara felt a wave of emotions wash over her. She hadn't expected to find a brother, nor had she asked for it. But now that he stood before her, she couldn't ignore what this bond meant. "I don't know what will happen from here, Jack," she answered honestly. "I had no idea you existed until recently. But now that I know, I feel like we have a chance to be something. Family. I know it won't be easy, and maybe you don't want it. But I'm willing to try if you are." The silence between them was interrupted by the distant sound of cars passing on the road. Jack looked at Clara, then at Henry, battling the storm of emotions inside him. He wasn't ready for a warm embrace, but something inside him, something he had been suppressing for years, began to give way. "I need time," he finally said, stepping back. "I don't know if I can handle all this right now, but if what you're saying is true, maybe we can talk again." Clara nodded, feeling a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a start. She knew Jack's wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but the mere fact that he was willing to talk again was a small victory. "We'll be here when you're ready," she said softly. Jack didn't respond immediately. He gave one last look at Henry, his eyes still filled with confusion, but no longer with the same hardness as before. Then, he turned and walked back into the garage, leaving Clara and Henry standing outside, feeling the chill of the afternoon air wrap around them. "Maybe he'll need more time than we thought," Henry murmured, a mix of sadness and hope in his voice. Clara touched Henry's arm, comforting him. "He showed up. That's more than we expected, Uncle." The two of them walked back along the dirt road, the sun setting behind the hills of Georgia. There was still much to be done, but for the first time, Clara felt like the pieces of her life were beginning to fall into place. The weeks following the encounter in Georgia were marked by an unsettling silence. Clara and Henry had returned to New York with mixed feelings of hope and uncertainty. Jack hadn't made any contact, and the days seemed to drag on with the lingering expectation of a response that might never come. Clara, despite her always busy and professional life, often found herself lost in thoughts about the brother she had discovered. Each time the phone rang, her heart would race with the hope that it might be him, but the line remained silent. Henry, for his part, tried to hide his anxiety, but Clara could see how much it affected him with each passing day. Jack's silence was like an open wound that Henry carried along with all his regrets. On that Sunday morning, as the autumn sun bathed New York in a soft light, Clara decided to visit Henry at his small apartment. She wanted to check on him, and secretly she also wanted to talk about Jack, although she knew the subject brought invisible pain to her uncle. When she arrived, she found Henry sitting on the balcony, a cup of hot tea in his trembling hands. He smiled at her, but his gaze was distant, as if his thoughts were far beyond the present moment. "How are you, Uncle?" Clara asked, sitting beside him. Henry shrugged, taking a sip of tea. "I'm fine, Clara. As fine as an old man like me can be." He smiled, but Clara could see the fatigue in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about Jack," she confessed after a pause. "Do you think he'll reach out?" Henry remained silent for a moment, watching the horizon. "I don't know, dear. I can't blame him if he doesn't. What I did, what I failed to do, it's hard to forgive. But just knowing that he's alive, that he's out there, that's something." Clara nodded, understanding the depth of Henry's feelings. She knew her uncle didn't expect full redemption, but deep down, he longed for one last chance to make peace with his past. As they talked, the sound of the phone interrupted the moment. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she saw Henry slowly get up to answer it. Their eyes met briefly, and for an instant, they both felt the unlikely possibility that it could be Jack. Henry answered, his voice trembling. "Hello? Who's this?" Clara watched Henry's expression change. The silence on the other end was brief, but then his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Jack?" Henry whispered, barely able to believe it. A chill ran down Clara's spine. He had finally called. She stood up slowly, moving closer to Henry, trying to catch what was happening on the other side of the line. Yes, yes, I'm listening, Henry said, with tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Of course, of course. When? Yes, we can. Tomorrow? Yes, of course, Clara and I will be there. As he hung up, Henry looked at Clara, emotions flooding his face. He wants to see us tomorrow, Henry said. His voice choked with emotion. He wants to talk. Clara's heart swelled with both relief and anxiety. Finally, the moment they had been waiting for had arrived. It wouldn't be easy, she knew, but it was a chance to start over, to try and rebuild what had been lost. The next day, Clara and Henry arrived at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, where Jack had arranged to meet them. The place was simple but cozy, with outdoor tables and a peaceful view of the surrounding landscape. The morning sun illuminated the scene, bringing a sense of hope to the moment. They arrived before Jack, and the waiting time was filled with tense silence. Henry fidgeted with his hands, visibly nervous, while Clara tried to remain calm, though she felt the same nervousness building inside her. When Jack finally appeared, he looked different from the man they had met weeks ago. There was less stiffness in his shoulders, and though his expression was still serious, it seemed more open. Clara watched him cautiously, trying to read the emotions hidden behind his face. "Thanks for coming," Jack said as he sat down. His voice was controlled, but there was something new in it, a willingness that Clara hadn't seen before. "We're the ones who should be thanking you for reaching out," Clara replied, smiling slightly, trying to break the ice. Henry remained silent, his gaze fixed on Jack, as if every word was a delicate step over fragile ground. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "I know it's not easy for you to be here, Jack, and I know nothing I say can change the past. But I want you to know that I'm here, willing to listen." His voice was sincere, heavy with emotion. Jack nodded but didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, trying to balance the hurt he felt with the desire to understand what had happened. "I spent a long time trying to forget about you," he finally said. "You, my father, the idea of having a family. It was easier that way, you know? But," he paused, looking at Clara, "after you showed up, I realized there were still things I needed to face." Clara watched her brother closely. She understood the weight of his words. Facing the past was painful, but it was also necessary to move forward. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Henry said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "But if there's anything I can do, even if it's just to listen, I'll be here. I won't run away anymore." Jack studied him for a long moment, the tension in his face gradually softening. "I'm not here to forgive or forget everything all at once," Jack said honestly. "But I'm willing to try to understand. Maybe we can start slow, see where it leads." Clara felt a lump form in her throat at those words. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. And at that moment it was all they needed. "That's more than we could have hoped for," she replied, with a genuine smile. The coffee was served, and the conversation began slowly, like someone cautiously stepping on uncertain ground. But little by little the words started to flow, and the gap between them began to close. There were no promises of a future without difficulties, but there was an opening, a chance to rewrite their story. As the sun shone brightly over New York, Clara, Henry, and Jack allowed themselves something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. The past was still there, full of wounds and unresolved stories, but the future, for the first time in many years, seemed open to new possibilities. Together, they decided to walk this path, knowing that while they couldn't change what had been, they could at least walk side by side in whatever was yet to come.